الحمد للإله سابغ النعم وخالق الإنسان من بعد العدم، فالحمد ثم الحمد ثم الحمد لك حمدا كثيرا طيبا يا رب لك. أعطيتنا خيرا كثيرا ربنا، سترت عن كل الورى عيوبنا، ثم الصلاة بعد والتسليم على النبي المصطفى الكريم.
Everybody, greetings. We're very lucky to have a guest today. I always say that. It's always true, but just in terms of, let's say, like you could have sizes of luck. This is a larger size of luck in the sense that it's very hard to book our guests. You have to talk to him significantly far in advance. So, because he's extremely busy. And, I'm busy, but he's really busy. Our guest is Dr. Yasir Qadhi, who many of you, he has the shortest bio I've actually ever been handed on this sheet, which is interesting, because, his sort of description is probably, just in terms of media and global significance, more than most professors can hope for. He is very well known around the world as a Muslim scholar. Do you like mentioning the native institutions you've been associated with?
No, doesn't matter. But
he was one of the founders of the Maghrib Institute, right? And which teaches classes around the world, and he was the academic dean for a while. I'm not sure if you're still involved in it, not anymore. And so he's, you can find videos of him speaking in Singapore or Malaysia or England or wherever. It's extremely a large following amongst Muslim youth, or amongst Muslims generally in the world. And his regular job, however, he's a professor, which is of course the most noble of professions. He has a BS in chemical engineering from the University of Houston. I guess you didn't follow up on that path.
Not really. Dow Chemical for sure.
You don't mix stuff in your sink or like that.
I joke that's a very explosive combination to have a chemical engineering degree and a Islamic Seminary degree.
Yeah.
Pun intended.
Yeah. So, and he has a BA in Hadith Studies and MA in Islamic Theology from Islamic University of Medina, and he's a PhD in Islamic Studies from Yale University. In fact, your advisor was here just a few weeks ago, Wolverine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was down here visiting.
Okay, cool.
He's currently a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Rhodes College in Tennessee, and he's the Dean of the Islamic Seminary of America, which is based in Dallas.
Dallas.
In Dallas. So, Yasir is, well known for lots of things, but I don't think people appreciate his sort of academic inclination, and we have lots of great discussions about sort of obscure issues of Islamic law or theology, and he's the only person at least I know whose voice WhatsApp messages I've saved in my research folder, because we have these discussions. He has excellent information. So we're really happy to have him come talk about Rethinking Salafism, Shifting Trends and Changing Typologies Post-Arab Spring. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. First, I apologize about my voice. I just came back from England and haven't quite recovered from that journey. Let me go back around almost 30 years, 26 years ago, when I was a freshman or a sophomore at the University of Medina in Saudi Arabia, long time ago. I believe it was 96 or 97, long time ago. And I remember the University of Medina, if you don't know, is one of the premier institutions of academic learning of the Islamic world. And of course, it has a Salafi understanding and underpinning. It's one of the most prestigious Salafi university in the world, and I studied there for 10 years. So I was a freshman or a sophomore, and I remember that lots and lots of books were being distributed for free at a particular day. And obviously as students, free books, like, wow, that's like free candy. So we all lined up and we got, the free book that was being distributed. At the time, the University of Medina was 80% non-Saudi. That's changed completely. It's supposed to be a majority Saudi now, but when I was studying, it was a majority non-Saudi institution. So 80% of the students are non-Saudi. Keep that point in mind. What was the book that was being distributed for free? I still have it in my library, along with the other few thousands of books I have. It was called Wujub Ta'at Wali al-Amr. The obligation of obeying the ruler. And it was a small treatise that essentially commanded the students, or taught the students, it was distributed for free, to basically believe that obeying the ruler is a part and parcel of the religion of Islam. It is wajib, it is God's obligation on you to obey the ruler. And of course, that was a theme that was taught overtly and covertly. It was a very clear part of our agenda. I remember when the Mufti came to our university, the current Mufti, Abdul Aziz al-Sheikh, when he came to our university, the talk that he gave was essentially the exact same, which is the obligation of obeying the ruler. And I want to say on a personal note, even though I was only, 21, 22 at the time, and obviously times have changed and my views have changed, I wasn't naive to the fact that this is propaganda. I understood fully that the universities or the government is handing out free booklets for self-serving interests. But I'll be honest with you, I bought it at the time. Yeah, not the book, it was free. I bought the idea at the time. Why? Because, frankly, it was theologically convincing. The setup of the book, the agenda of the book, the quotes from the book. I fully understood that the government has an agenda for distributing this book free of charge. But that agenda to me was irrelevant to the content, because the content seemed solid and academic. The quotations from Ibn Taymiyyah, the famous hadith that are found in Bukhari and Muslim, Sam'a wa Ta'a, these are well-known traditions in our hadith canonical literature. And of course, it takes a lot of research and a lot of contemplation to understand that, well, that is one interpretation, and there are other interpretations even within the faith tradition. And my point for starting off with this anecdote is, of course, it's directly related to what we're going to be doing here, because what we're talking about is, of course, Salafism post-Arab Spring. And the one thing that this has really demonstrated for us is how vast and how varied the Salafi trend is. So let us begin from the beginning. Very quickly, what exactly is Salafism? Of course, by now, I hope all of us understand that all serious academics make a distinction between what is called Enlightenment Salafism, which is Rashid Rida and Afghani and Abdu, which has very little to do with the actual movement that is called the Salafi movement. And I've defined Salafism, I'm currently writing a book on it, I've defined Salafism as a strand of Sunni Islam that originated in the classical Ahl al-Hadith school of the classical time frame, and which considers as authoritative and divine the two sources, the Quran and authentic Hadith. Historically, Salafis or Atharis prioritize the importance of creed and its conception of all of God's attributes as being literally true without resembling the creation, remains unique amongst all other strands of Islam. That is really what separates Salafis from all other strands. It is an aspect of obscure theology that most people really don't care about unless you're part and parcel of the whole debate of God's attributes. Salafis aspire to emulate what they view as the perfect understanding of the two sources, the Quran and Sunnah, via the theology and the practices of the earliest generations of Islam. Here, the symbol here is, of course, Salafis want to go back to the past, the purity. They view Islam as having been corrupted. They view Islam as having left the plot over the last 14 centuries. And the original Islam is the pure Islam. So they want to go back and rediscover the purity, the way that it used to be practiced in the first 3 centuries, in particular the first 3 generations. Hence the term Salafi, going back to the Salaf, going back to the earliest generations. And of course, as we all hopefully know, you're all graduate students or professors or specialists in the field, of course, when they say going back to the first 3 generations, they don't mean socially and technologically. They mean ritually and theologically. Salafis are not Amish. Salafis are very technically savvy. They're not living in a bubble apart from society. They're talking about going back to the rituals and the rituals and the theological and legal understandings of the Salaf, not the cultural, not the technological issues. Now, that's one definition of Salafism. Where do Salafis differ amongst themselves? There are many aspects of disagreement amongst Salafis. There are some finer issues of theology that I've written about and not really relevant to ours, which Salafis do differ about. There are also a spectrum of opinion about Islamic law. Not all Salafis follow the same understanding of law. But most importantly for Western analysts, for those outside of the Salafi trend, what has brought their attention to the differences between Salafis is how Salafis deal with the rulers, politics, how they deal with the concept of jihad, what is the relationship with the political systems of their regimes that they are living in. And if you look at this area, you find that there has never been, and nor shall there ever be, any unified understanding of how to deal with politics, how to deal with jihad. What you find actually is very, very diverse, contradictory, and competing claims of truth within the movement. To the extent that at times what separates these strands within Salafism is more significant than what unites them. And Salafism has always been historically and up until now, always been marred with controversies of legitimacy, with authenticity. Which Salafi strand is the most authentic? And it is a hallmark of Salafism to accuse other strands of being deviant or of being, mubtadi' or tabdi', not fully following the proper methodology. This is something that every Salafi researcher knows. And what the Arab Spring did, it was, in my humble opinion, the single greatest catalyst in the last century to demonstrate how varied these Salafi positions were. Also, the Arab Spring had a pretty interesting effect on large segments of Salafis in that it transformed a very quietist, apolitical strand of Salafism to become extremely politicized. The Arab Spring acted as a catalyst to politicize some of the larger strands of apolitical, quietist Salafism, as we will discuss. But before we get there, very briefly, what are some of the categorizations that have been given of Salafis up until our times? Perhaps the most famous, what is considered to be the hallmark, what is considered to be the definitive, or used to be considered definitive, was Quentin Wiktorowicz's paper back in 2005. He released a paper called The Anatomy of the Salafi Movement. And he was one of the first to academically try to dissect the various strands of Salafi Islam. And in that paper, he argued that Salafis are united in their belief, but divided in political methodology. And Wiktorowicz defined Salafis as those who share three primary beliefs. Number one, a strict understanding of monotheism, tawheed. Number two, the Quran and Sunnah are sufficient for human guidance. And number three, a dislike for logic and reason. I strongly disagree with all three of those, but that's a separate point altogether. Wiktorowicz argues that these shared beliefs are common amongst all Salafis. Footnote, not true, but anyway. He argued they're common amongst all Salafis, but they are divided in their approach to politics. And he divided Salafis into three categories. Purists, these are all his terminologies. Purists, politicos, and jihadists. Purists, politicos, and jihadists. According to Wiktorowicz, purists are those who avoid politics and who focus on education and da'wah, preaching and proselytization. Okay? And he gave examples of the three big names of Salafi Islam back in the 90s, the three giants of Salafi Islam, Al-Albani of Jordan, Ibn Uthaymeen of Unais of Arabia, and Ibn Baz, the Grand Mufti. These three are considered universally by almost all strands to really be the most significant or the most important Salafi clerics. They're all passed away, obviously, in our time, but in the 90s they were considered to be the big three. So he says all three of them are basically in the purest strand. He then said there's another strand called the politicos. And the politicos are those who engage in politics through activism and through discussion and dialogue. They want to use the system. They're operating from within the system, and they're not calling for open rebellion. And of course, the main example given of politicos were Safar al-Hawali and Salman al-Auda picture. So this is the Grand Mufti currently, Abdul Aziz al-Sheikh. And that is Safar al-Hawali, sorry, that is Salman al-Auda, who is currently in jail because of a tweet that he made last year. So that's an example of a politico. That's somebody who's trying to change the system from within the system, very actively engaged in politics. And then of course the final strand was that of the jihadist strand, and of course the article came out 2005, so obviously the obvious example was Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. So Wiktorowicz's categorization became, and to a large extent remains, the industry standard within the Salafi academic, Western academic world. It is still quoted to this day. And you will find people still mentioning purist politicos and jihadists as if Victorowitz is basically still the given. However, of course, there have been other attempts as well. I'll just briefly mention two of them. Zoltan Paul, back in 2013, he wrote a book as well about Salafis, and he attempted to categorize Salafis into two main categories. Under each of the two main, there were two subdivisions, so you have four categories. Two main, under each one there was two, so 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B. And he categorized Salafis once again, very similar to Victorowitz. It's as if Victorowitz was the first domino, and everybody else that came is kind of sort of stuck in wed to that paradigm. So Zoltan Paul categorized Salafis into two, and as I said, each two is further subdivided into two. The two main ones were purists and harakis or activists. Purists, straight from Victorowitz, and harakis or activists, which is basically politicos. However, he said purists are divided into two categories. This is not Victorowitz, this is Paul. Purists are divided into two categories, he said. The first of them, he said, were those who are rejectionists to the political system, and he gave the example of Al-Albani in Jordan. He's not participating in the political system. And the others, he said, are, that's his term, politico-purists. He kind of weds these two together, because politico-purists. These are those who use the political system, but to support the ruler, such as the clergy of Saudi Arabia, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia. So they're not aloof like Al-Albani, they're not out of the system, they're using the system to buttress the system. So they're supporting the ruler. So these are political purists. They're purists in the sense that they are overall supportive of the regimes that they're a member of. So he said there's purists of one side and there's purists of the political side. And then he said the harakis or the activists are also two. And so the first are the activists through social media, through parliaments in Kuwait, others such as Salman al-Hawali. And so these are through political activism. And then there are the political jihadists such as Bin Laden. Frankly, he took the same three, he made them into four, if you understand what I'm saying. He just thought he's doing something new, but he's not. It's really the same thing. Victorowitz essentially is redone through Paul. In an article in 2006, Joas Wagemacher expands upon this typology of Victorowitz. And the title of the article is Revisiting Victorowitz. And it's probably one of the better articles, even though obviously, me being who I am, I don't agree with pretty much anything written about Salafis, but that's a separate point altogether. But nonetheless, it was definitely much better than anything previous to this. And his basic premise was that he's going to agree on the general definitions of Victorowitz, but he argues that these categories are way too broad. And he then goes into detail about how each one should further be subdivided into many, and I'm not going to go into all of that. I'm just going to make you one example, give you one example so that you understand. Wagemacher firstly doesn't like the term purist, because he says they're not purists, they're quietist. In fact, all Salafis view themselves as being purists. That's what Salafi means, to go back to the pure understanding. So the term, he said, is not correct to be used here. Also, he says that quietist cannot be put into one category, because there are many different types of quietists, and he, in his article, actually subdivides quietists. The quietist is Victorious purist, right? So that's his understanding. He divides quietists into three categories. Number one, he calls them the aloofists. Okay, all of these are interesting terminologies coming from this article, right? So the first are aloofists, who avoid politics altogether. They just don't get involved, they don't talk about politics at all. Number two are loyalists, those who support the Muslim rulers passively. And the classic example is the muftis of Saudi Arabia and the senior clergy of Saudi Arabia. And then number three are propagandists, those who are actively supporting the Muslim rulers. Most prominent is, of course, the Rabi' al-Madkhali, or the Madkhali strand of Salafi Islam, if you are aware of that. So he divides the quietists into three, and similarly politicos into a number, and jihadists into a number. And his article is definitely a refined version of Victorowitz, and definitely much better. Nonetheless, he as well misses a very critical point, which is of course quite problematic, and yet it is something that I think is very important to mention, and that is that within this quietist trend, there is a very, very much more nuanced spectrum that we need to be clear about, especially when it comes to the post-Arab Spring. If one lumps all quietists based upon how they're acting, I think that misses the point. One needs to go back and understand theologically why are they quietist, which nobody has actually done. Neither Wajmaker nor Wagmaker or Victorians, they've never done that. They've never gone and understood why are these particular people quietists from a theological perspective. And that is why, in my humble opinion, all of these are very, very flawed categorizations of Salafis. And that is because, just to give you again a simple example, that quietists themselves are a very, very interesting spectrum. And I'll give you only 3 examples amongst them. Some quietists interpret the text to indicate that supporting the ruler is an act of faith and a fundamental pillar of the religion. So if you do not support the ruler, you are a heretic. And of course the primary example of this is the Madkhalis. They make it a theological point of faith that you must support the ruler. Out of all of the quietists, whatever my personal position might be about them, they are the most consistent. They will support the ruler regardless. And
Any ruler or just?
Any ruler, as long as there's no kufr bawah, and we haven't seen them pronounce kufr bawah on any ruler, including Mubarak and Sisi. So essentially, it translates as any ruler. Yes. Okay? Kufr bawah is blatant apostasy, as one phrase of the hadith says. But there's a second strand of quietists. And these, I call them theological pragmatists. And these people, what they argue is that the current rule, and this is especially the case back in the 90s when I was a student there, and I know this because many of them were my teachers. Almost all the people that we're going to be talking about I've met personally, except that guy on the far right. I have never met him. Just disclaimer, never shook hands. Make sure everybody makes a note of that, but pretty much everybody else I have met and know personally from my studies and whatnot. What was I saying? So they're theological pragmatists, and what they argue is that we're not saying that the ruler is an angel, that the ruler has to be supported, but at least the ruler is allowing us to preach Salafi doctrine, to teach the people the right way of Islam, and because he's allowing us to do that, we'll turn a blind eye to many of the other issues, because what's important for us, this is what the senior clergy would argue, it's not as if they love the ruler like the Madkhalis do. It's not as if they're wanting to support the ruler. They're seeing him as, well, you know what, he might have a lot of bad things, but the perk that he's giving us in allowing us to preach our version of Islam is worth the negatives. Now, this is important because if the tide is going to shift, such as right now with MBS, because this is back in the 90s when Fahd was in charge, King Fahd was in charge. If the tide is going to shift, these theological pragmatists might shift as well. And we're seeing this post-Arab Spring. You have to go back and understand, why are they quietists? There is yet another strand of quietism. And these, I call them political pragmatists, not theological. What they argue is that the political engagement of the ruler potentially might lead to a worse situation. They point to Iraq, they point to Syria. So, status quo is bad. We don't like it. We wish we could change it. We love to change it. It's allowed to change, but only if we feel confident enough that the change is going to be tangible. We don't want another Iraq, another Syria. These aren't theological pragmatists. These are political pragmatists. And a lot of the politicos are actually political pragmatists. They're a type of quietist. I don't agree with the categorization here, but that's besides the point as well. Also, there's yet another major problem with all of these categorizations, aptly illustrated in your diagram over here. What the heck is a duck doing in a Salafi presentation at Georgetown? I wanted to make a challenge, and I'm going to quote a duck and put a duck in my picture here. In all honesty, what is this picture doing? If I were to ask, how many of you in this room? 50. If I were to ask all of you, what's the first thing that strikes you? I wouldn't get a common answer. Every one of you would find something bizarre or interesting. And what you found interesting would be more indicative of you than of the picture. Basically, what I'm trying to say, when Western academics look at Salafism, they're coming with their own Saidian orientalizations, and they're trying to fit their models onto the Salafi strands, not looking at how Salafis themselves view their tradition. What they find bizarre, what they find quantifiable, what they find worthy of demarcation might not be how Salafis themselves view their own trends. And I think that's one of the biggest problems of all of these outsider academics, is that they don't quite understand from within what is important. Hence, for example, to this day, It's so frustrating. Like 95% of the articles and the books that I read about Salafism, the adjectives that are used and the examples given are not unique to Salafi Islam whatsoever. And yet that's what academic, Salafis are a very ultra-conservative brand of Islam who think that Valentine's Day is haram. Let me share with you something. It's not only the Salafis that think Valentine's Day is haram. Salafis think music and dancing should not be done. There are Shiites in Karbala that don't dance with music as well. That's not what is definitive about Salafi Islam. And that's the problem when you're an outsider. What you find bizarre, what you find weird, might not necessarily be what they themselves are interested in. And that's, I think, one of the biggest problems of any categorization scheme that is done by those who have vested interests. And of course, as Foucault says, we all have our vested interests as we approach knowledge. We all have our preconceived notions of what we want to do. And the reason why, let's be honest here, why is Salafism so hot and sexy these days? It's because it's linked to jihadism. It's because that's what people are interested in. And that's why people are studying Salafis. So it's understandable that they're trying to categorize Salafis based upon politics and based upon dealings with the rulers, but the fact of the matter is that's not how most Salafis themselves, what they're concerned about primarily. And that's not how they would view themselves. So I will propose an alternative categorization at the end, one that does not involve a duck, don't worry, but that's going to be at the end of the lecture. So now, let us jump into our little bit of our actual talk, and that is post-Arab Spring. And I wanted to take Egypt as one simple case study. Egyptian Salafism, of course, is a well-studied phenomenon. It began officially back in 1926 with the Ansar al-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya, but it always remained a very, very small academic strand, limited to elite intellectual clerics and circles. However, Salafism in Egypt changed radically from the late 70s and especially in the 80s, and it became a tidal wave in the 90s. Why? What changed? Two major factors, more than two, but for our purposes two. Number one, the rise of a new breed of clerics, most of whom had trained in Saudi Arabia, such as Muhammad Hassan, such as Muhammad Ismail al-Muqaddam, some in Jordan, such as Abu Ishaq al-Huwaini. And number two, I think more important than number one, the fact that the Egyptian security apparatus made an unofficial wedding with the Salafis back in the 80s and 90s. They made an alliance, and that alliance was, we'll allow you the platform of the media, of satellite channels. We'll allow your preachers to preach. Go ahead, we're not really going to bother you too much. They didn't give a full green light, but by and large, Salafis were given a free pass to do everything they wanted. By and large, there are some exceptions to this. And most importantly, massive satellite channels in the 90s opened up, and Salafi preachers would be preaching to not only Egypt, but the entire world. Most prominent amongst them is Qanat al-Nas on the right-hand side, Muhammad Hussein Yaqub, and of course Muhammad Hassan. The two of them are the main figures of the Qanat al-Nas, which was one of the most well-watched channels of the time. Now, it seems that, for the time frame, there was a lot of disenfranchisement with the Azhar institution and clerics. There's a vacuum of other, preachers. And so some of these clerics became international superstars. The 90s also witnessed the rise of what I call Islamic televangelism, such as, Muhammad Hassan is definitely one of the first, Muslim televangelists in the world. And Qanat al-Nas is one of the main, mediums where that has happened. And the security apparatus, why would they do this? Why would Egyptian security, why would the mukhabarat, why would the government want or tacitly allow the Salafis to have free reign? I think it's obvious, and that is that they felt that quietist, pacifist Salafism, which was and remains the mainstream Salafism, would be an innocuous, innocent method to allow religious people to express their religious tendencies without getting involved in the politics. So they felt that if we allow the Salafis free reign, we're going to get these religious Muslim Brotherhood folks to become more Salafi, and they'll become quietist, apolitical, because that was Qanat al-Nas, that was Muhammad Hussein Yaqub, I forgot to mention. Muhammad Hassan, these guys were basically apolitical. They were the Albani type of Salafis, not even criticizing Mubarak, having nothing to do with politics. It's just about doctrines and rituals and prayer and how to pray and where to place the hands and how loud to say Ameen and where to put the pants. All of this stuff the government didn't care about. So the government gave them free pass, and these people became more and more popular. And it seems to have worked for that time frame. That is because Salafis, generally speaking, throughout the 90s in Egypt, were really apolitical and quietists. However, with the start of the protests in the street, the start of the Arab Spring, that's when things began to change. Now, interestingly enough, at the very beginning of the protests, the senior Salafi clerics across Egypt, not a single voice amongst them supported the protesters in the beginning. That was the training they had done. Wujub ta'at wali al-amr. You have to obey the ruler. That was the training, that was the theology. You don't oppose the ruler. And some of the most senior clerics, such as Ismail Muqaddam and others, they gave fatwas to their followers, do not go out in the streets. Do not protest against the government. They followed the fatwas from the Saudi scholars who said that this is ghawgha, this is ribble-rabble, this is like, the mob mentality. They called street protesters mob mentality. So they gave fatwas to their followers, don't do that. However, and this is where it all begins to change, as the tidal wave of public support changed, as people began to rally and the enthusiasm became really toxic just throughout the entire country, we saw for the first time these pacifist, quietist, apolitical Salafis start rethinking through their quietism. And slowly but surely, the main televangelist, Muhammad Hassan, who initially was kind of grudging towards the protesters, he made a point to appear in the streets. He gave a very strategic interview with the protesters, not quite 100% pulling his weight in, pushing his weight in, but at the same time not pushing his weight out. He wanted to have a foot in both just in case something happened. But the fact that he was on the streets and he made a point to be interviewed on the streets, I'm with the people here and I'm chanting as they're chanting, he's showing himself with them, even if he's not being one of their leaders. That was kind of sort of the beginning of the tidal wave of change that took place. And then slowly but surely with the displacement of Mubarak and the open call for elections, essentially almost all Salafis, except for the Madkhali branch, they have been always the most consistent. Almost all Salafis overnight, and this is what's most amazing, went from purists, apolitical quietists to Haraki activists. Almost overnight, within the span of less than a week or two. The same scholars a few weeks ago that have been saying, don't protest, don't go out, all of a sudden they're saying, we need to stand for election. We need to take charge of our country. If we don't do something, these secularists, these liberals are going to come. So they started giving fatwas. One of the most famous, one amongst them said, I used to say that democracy is haram. Now I say participation in democracy is our jihad. That's our jihad. Jihad here means obviously the struggle. We're going to go and struggle through democracy. We're going to fight not through the bullets but the ballots. He literally made that phrase in Arabic. That's going to be our jihad, going to the polls and making sure that we win. And of course, we all know what happened. In 2011, in the first round of elections, Salafis won an astonishing 25% of the popular vote. I mean, even I know my Salafis inside out, it was shocking. 25%? Where did that come from? In just 10 years, that's what had happened. In 10 years of preaching and teaching, 25% of the Egyptians, the Muslim Brotherhood has been operating for 80 plus years. And they got 70% of the Islamist vote. 25% is going to the Salafi parties. This seems to have emboldened the Salafis even more. If they could win 1/4 of the seats with just the quickest of campaigns, the most rudimentary campaigns, what could happen if they actually took charge of the system? And that is when a number of interesting changes happened. Most importantly, Yasir Burhami, this person over here, Yasir Burhami, same name, but absolutely nothing to do with the methodology or tactic. They just have this first name, that's it. Nothing else shared with him. Yasir Burhami was one of the main founders, not the main guy, but he is now the main guy, of the Hizb al-Nur, which was a political party from the Da'wah Salafiyya that used to give fatwas that political parties are haram. The same group, Da'wah Salafiyya, which was the mainstream Salafi group that used to say political parties are haram, one of their main clerics, after Arab Spring, founded Hizb al-Nur, which becomes the main Salafi party that's going to run in the elections. They ran, and of course, as we all know, Mursi, became the president, and they grudgingly gave their support to Mursi. Long story short, they fell out with each other. Burhami and Mursi fell out with each other, and then eventually Burhami with his Hizb al-Nur and the Salafis became the main opposition, or one of the main oppositions to President Mursi. And they sided with Sisi in the coup, and they then supported Sisi, and they gave fatwas to their followers that Sisi is a better a candidate than Mursi. And after the revolution, or after the impeachment of Mursi and the coming to power of Sisi, Hizb al-Nur publicly allied with Sisi's regime, and to this day they are cozy with Sisi's regime, and they felt that by allying with the ruler, it will ensure that they will have the necessary freedom and the perks. However, what has happened is that popular tragically as well, I mean, my personal bias is being revealed here, but Burhami and others turned a blind eye to the massacre of Rabi'a as well. They did not criticize Sisi, and they didn't publicly support like Grand Mufti of Azhar, but they basically, well, they had to do what they had to do, it was forced, etc. That type of grudging type of, they didn't proclaim they're happy, but they definitely did not criticize. Now what happened is that, of course, within the Salafi movement, plenty of splinter groups formed. Some amongst them, such as, I give an example here, there's actually a dozen or so, but one of the more prominent was Dr. Atiyah Adlan formed the Islah Party, and the Islah Party basically, and you can even tell, even by even though he's coming from a Salafi background, trim beard, suit and tie, already the Muslim Brotherhood look is there. Typically the Salafis are, the thobe and the beards and the caps, they're more puritanical in their dress code, but Atiyah Adlan is that strand of harakis that is now going towards the Muslim Brotherhood, so much so that essentially he ran on a Muslim Brotherhood platform, even though his theology and his legal school is Salafi, right? So that's what a number of things happened post-Arab Revolution, that Arab Spring, that demonstrated Salafis splintered into many groups. The only person who actually remained consistent was the small, strand of Madkhali Salafism. Most famous amongst them is Muhammad Sa'id Raslan, who basically, whoever was the ruler at the time, would have to obey the ruler. Whether it was Mursi or Sisi or whatnot, that's what theology teaches. And even though he has a very small following, and even though generally speaking he's not respected, still he remained consistent to whatever principles that he had. Now what we saw therefore is that the Arab Spring came along, and these clear demarcations that everybody thought they're talking about, Wagmaker or Victorious, it completely convoluted everything. And that demonstrated that these clear, these clear demarcations, these clear pigeonhole boxes, it doesn't make sense, and it's not going to make sense unless you understand the theological underpinnings of why they feel the way that they did. What is the reason that they felt the way that they did? And what the Arab Spring did, it really acted like a catalyst to demonstrate that Salafis themselves, either they didn't think things through, which is also true, or that this notion of quietism, pacifism, political activism, jihadism, it was just a strategic move, not a theological one. And when the situation changed, they changed. And that's what we saw with the Arab Spring. Now, of course, the fact of the matter is we can give a lecture about every single, country in the Arab world, and there is no question that the Arab Spring affected Egypt probably more than any other country. But the same cannot be said of other lands, and I'm not going to give a lecture about every single country, obviously. But the fact of the matter is that each country reacted differently for the Arab Spring. For example, Lebanon, for example, there was a very, very minimal impact of the Arab Spring, almost indiscernible. Yes, there was a small influx of jihadi Salafis, but that was because of Syria, not actually local. They didn't really impact the local Salafis that much. In Kuwait, a very interesting scenario emerges. Kuwaiti Salafism, because of the figure of Abdurrahman Abdul Khalid from back in the 80s, Kuwaiti Salafism had always been the most quote-unquote political, the most haraki from back in the 80s, especially under the banner of the Jam'iyyat Ihya Turath, the revival of the Islamic Heritage, RIHS society, and it was one of the main opposition parties to the government. The Arab Spring didn't change the strands of Salafism in Kuwait, but what it did do, it exacerbated the tensions between the pre-existing strands. These pre-existing strands, the Madkhalis, the Quietists, the Harakis, they did not change. There was no shifting of loyalties, interesting, by and large. There was no shifting of loyalties. Kuwaiti Salafism remained as is, but these strands just diverged even more, and the acrimony, the animosity between them was exacerbated by the Arab Spring. And of course, one of the most prominent figures of Kuwaiti Haraki Salafism is Dr. Hakim al-Mutayri, who is the founder of the Hizb al-Ummah party, which is one of the most interesting parties to study. Dr. Hakim al-Mutayri has over 1 million followers on Twitter, and if you just log on to his Facebook and Twitter, he is a professor of Islamic studies, of Quran, of Hadith and Tafsir, and he is a political analyst, par excellence in the sense for his people. Whether I agree or disagree is besides the point. Always talking about politics, always analyzing what's going on in the world, and his party, Hizb al-Ummah, is attracting more and more attention and more followers. But he started his party way before the Arab Spring. Only thing the Arab Spring did was that it boosted his credibility. It boosted his acceptance. He didn't change his methodology. Kuwaiti Salafism, by and large, remained as it is, but it's simply the Arab Spring acted as a catalyst to some strands. The same can be said of other countries as well. I don't want to go into Tunisia. I'm definitely not going to touch Syria over here. Not at all. That's a whole different lecture, not related to this talk about Salafis, because that's a speciality in and of itself. Saudi Arabia, just a brief point before I move on to the final few slides. Saudi Arabia, even though I am the most aware of Saudi Salafis, having lived there for almost 2 decades of my life, I think that it is too premature to talk about the effects of the Arab Spring, because the Arab Spring was very quickly followed by the coming to power of this new MBS, who's now in charge. And I think that the shock and awe of what MBS is doing, I think that many clerics are genuinely confused as to what to do. And we haven't quite seen the impact of not just the Arab Spring, but more so the impact of MBS on modern Saudi Salafis. Never before has any ruler of Saudi Arabia, since the time of Abdul Aziz, flouted so many of the laws that were considered to be Islamically sacrosanct with such impunity. Never before have so many scholars been rounded up, jailed, tortured, or killed for the flimsiest of reasons, and the clergy of Saudi Arabia, frankly, don't even know how to react yet. There's still a bit of a shock. However, from my anecdotal sources and my context that I have from just because I lived there for so many years, I really don't have direct context with any of the big players anymore. But just because of my context, I can tell you anecdotally, this isn't academic stuff, that more and more clerics seem to be sympathizing with Haraki, activist, political Salafism, even though 20 years ago, mainstream Saudi Salafism was apolitical. But because of what MBS is doing, and especially because of the crackdown against many of the respected clergy, and not to mention so many of the laws that are changing, there is now much more sympathy with the political strand. Having said that, there is also a much more digging deeper of the quietist apolitical branch. And most importantly, one of the most senior figures, probably more senior in terms of respect than even the Grand Mufti, is Salih al-Fawzan. Salih al-Fawzan was considered to be, he's still alive, he's considered to be of the same circle as Bin Baz and others in the same age group as that. Salih al-Fawzan, whose nephew, Abdul Aziz al-Fawzan, a friend of mine, is in jail, and very different methodology of his father. Abdul Aziz al-Fawzan is more Haraki Salafi, and his uncle is Salih al-Fawzan, the elder cleric. Salih al-Fawzan is not liked by MBS. This is again the key. It's really interesting here. There was a famous video of the king disrespecting al-Fawzan and not shaking his hand. The king Salman. That is like an insult to the Saudi clergy. Fawzan was insulted publicly because he publicly said that you shouldn't be having these intermixed parties or whatever is going on. So he gave a fatwa, and the king basically did not put him in jail. He was too powerful for that, but basically, was rude to him and whatnot. Still, Fawzan is a supporter of the king. Why? Because his theology is not madkhalism. His theology is not waving the flag of the Al Saud. His point is, look at Syria, look at Iraq, look at Libya. Do you want that for our country? An evil ruler is better than civil war. That's his line. He's not a flag waver and just a person who's just supporting the royal family. His point is, our religion teaches us that some sort of civil society is better than chaos, as the Quran says, وَالْفِتْنَةُ أَشَدُّ مِنَ الْقَتْلِ. So that's his main line here, and ironically he becomes a supporter of the Al Saud even as the Al Saud marginalizes him. Those are the types of interesting dynamics that takes place. Final points here. Well, what the Arab Spring has also demonstrated, very interestingly, this is probably the most significant, in my humble opinion, of the post-Arab Spring development, is shifting loyalties between the various scholars. In the 80s and 90s, it was unheard of for mainstream Salafis and mainstream Sufis to break bread together, allegorically. The theological differences went back 1,400 years or 1,200 years. They're not going to ignore those differences. Salafis call Sufis grave worshippers. Salafis call Shiites this and that. What we see post-Arab Spring is all of a sudden people's loyalties are shifting from abstract theology, from abstruse points of law, to on-the-ground politics. And I'll give you the most obvious example and the most important example, and that is the International Union of Muslim Scholars, Al-Ittihad Al-Alim Al-Islami Al-Muslimin, founded in 2004 by obviously Shaykh Qadhi. And at the time it was meant to be basically a conglomeration of all of the senior scholars of the world. And of course Shaykh Qadhi is of course the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, and his vision was to encompass all of the main schools of Islamic law. So he invited Salafis, Sufis, Shiites. He invited Shiites. There were Shiites there as well. Ibadis, Zaydis, all strands of Islam were represented. Currently, at one point in time, there were over 100,000 members of the international members. So the members are anybody who's a scholar of the region across all the countries of the world. Now, obviously, only 100, 200 are senior members, but it's 100,000 members. That was founded in 2004. Post-Arab Spring, the International Union of Muslim Scholars supported the Arab Spring. They were angry at Sisi. They issued a condemnation of the Rabi'a massacre, and not coincidentally, some of the senior clerics who supported these regimes, both Salafi and Sufi, resigned from the International Union of Muslim Scholars and eventually formed an alternative council, and that is the United Arab Emirates Peace Forum, which is an annual forum that takes place under the patronage of course, the rulers of the Emirates Republic. And currently, the International Union of Muslim Scholars is headed by what's the name again? Not Raisuni, Ahmed Raisuni. But one of the main figures is, of course, Sheikh Ahmed Dadu over here. Sheikh Ahmed Dadu over here is definitely one of the main figures of the International Party, and they are very, very political. Yesterday, as I was preparing for this talk, I logged onto their Twitter page, and their banner on their Twitter page is "Free the scholars that have been jailed because of their political views," with the pictures of Sheikh Safar al-Hawali and many other scholars that have been jailed. So that's their banner on Twitter. Free the scholars that have been jailed for their political views. They have publicly condemned Saudi Arabia for jailing many senior scholars and for their policies. They've condemned the Emirates for their issues. They've condemned Egypt for their issues. Obviously, what has this done? Those scholars that are supportive of the regimes, Salafi and Sufi, have withdrawn from that organization and formed their own. And Salafi and Sufi scholars have now cooperated together with the Emirates Peace Forum. Here we have the Minister of Islamic Justice, Al-Isa, over here. And here we have, of course, bin Bayya, who is, of course, the figurehead, the spiritual figurehead of this entire enterprise. Definitely the person that they groomed for that position. Of course, with, again, just a factual statement, in America as well, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf is a very big player in this Emirates Peace Forum, and he released a statement last year which caused a lot of controversy, where he described the Emirates as being a paragon of tolerance and virtue. Bin Bayya has already praised the Sultan as being the embodiment of the virtues of Islam, etc., etc. And understandably, the International Union of Muslim Scholars has been declared a terrorist organization by Egyptian scholars, by the fatwas of Al-Azhar, and by and large these groups are obviously completely disparate together. What is interesting, like I said, is this union now between Salafis and Sufis. Dadu is a Salafi, and Qaradawi is a Muslim Brotherhood, not quite the Salafi type. Here as well we have a Salafi and a Sufi. We're now getting alliances that have nothing to do with classical theology and have everything to do with politics, with who supports whom. And these alliances are the way things are heading in the post-Arab Spring. And I want to conclude here by somewhat convoluted, I'll very quickly go over this and I'm done. How then should we categorize Salafi groups? This is my categorization based upon having been a part of the movement for quite a lot of months, studied there and whatnot, and knowing the movement inside out, and obviously this public knowledge, I've left the movement and moved on. But still, I am very familiar with the movement, just having been a part of it for so long, and I understand the inner dynamics of the movement. And I propose a multivariable, open-ended typology. It's not simple, it's not easy, because Salafis, as we've already seen, they occupy many different ideas and many different understandings. What I propose is the following, very simply, and I'm going to elaborate on this in the book that I'm currently writing, and that is that we really do need to be, we can't be simplistic and look at Salafis only from politics, only from rulers, only from, no. Salafis are a very interesting group of people who differ on many key issues. So we need to categorize them multivariable, x, y axis. First and foremost, what did they themselves consider the most important for their group? And that's where these numbers come in. And for every group, we can swip those numbers around. So maybe some groups, this is going to be number 1, other groups, that's going to be number 5. So for every group, we give the priority to what they consider important, because that varies from group to group. For example, the Salafis of India, the Ahl Hadith movement, right? The Salafis of Pakistan, they're called the Ahl Hadith movement. Honestly, they couldn't care about the political stances toward the rulers. What they're interested in is point number 5, juristical tendencies. The biggest thing for the Ahl Hadith of India and Pakistan, how do you derive your Islamic law, your fiqh? What are your positions? That's how they're going to categorize you. And within the movement, you will have quietists, politicos, whatnot, and that's going to be tolerable. It's not going to be a big deal to them. So for them, that's what matters. For other groups, other things matter. So these are, I've just given the 5 main ones, and the 6 mean you can keep on adding. That's the point. It's multivariable, open-ended. A time is going to come where another issue becomes important. We can add it to the list, no problem. Also, it's a spectrum. You see that there's a color coding done on purpose. It's a spectrum. And I give you 5 different examples. The political stance towards the rulers. And we've talked about 5 or 6 different scenarios. We can categorize every strand. What is their political stance towards the rulers? Is it aloofist? Is it quietist? Why do they feel that way? The involvement in the political process. Do they think it's wise to be involved? Do they think it's wise to not be involved? Is it political? Is it theological? That's a very key point. Do they theologically believe, like Al-Albani used to believe, theologically, that it is corrupting to the soul to be in politics? It makes you a corrupt human being. You shouldn't get involved in politics because the purity of your faith is going to be sacrificed. That's a theological point here. Or is it simply because, oh, well, the current dynamics doesn't allow us, maybe tomorrow it will. So what is their role in the political process? A very key point that no author of academic Salafism discusses, even though in my mind it is one of the most important issues of Salafism. Who do Salafis consider to be Ahl al-Bid'ah? Wrong. And who do they consider to be kafir? By defining the other, you can see who they are. When they define the other, you see what's important to them, right? So what does each strand say about when does a strand become mubtadi' strand? When does a strand leave the fold of Salafism? And then when does it leave the fold of Islam? This is a very important factor to categorize Salafis as well. Obviously, interpretation, applicability of jihad, very important point as well. How do they view jihad? Is it something that is strategically permissible, theologically permissible, but strategically not? Is it strategically justified? You have a whole spectrum over here. Juristical tendencies, are they madhab, are they anti-madhab? You have an entire spectrum over here. And there are 3 main ones. You have the madhabist, you have the Ibn Taymiyyah, conservative but still madhabist, and then you have the Albani Zahiri. You have like the 3 strands over here. And then I added a point over there, which is you can keep on adding other things as well. The bottom line is that in order to understand any strand of Salafism, you need to view the world the way that they view it. And you need to prioritize what they prioritize. And that can be done by having this type of open-ended, multivariable typology. And if this were to be developed, maybe I'll develop, I don't know, we could literally maybe demarcate, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, and then literally for every group say, okay, this group is 1D, this group is 2F, this group, and you literally just list it, and it'll be understood by the people who understand your chart here, what type of Salafis they are, and what are they prioritizing over others. I think that's a much more realistic, academic, and accurate typography that will reflect the type of Salafism, and also, hopefully, it will also aid us in predicting what might happen if there's another revolution, if the situation changes. It will not necessarily, because sometimes Salafis change their mind, obviously, like any human being, but it might help us a little bit in that regard. To conclude, and on a personal note, Salafism definitely did have an appeal to many people, myself included, I will not deny that. And the reasons for that was because there was this notion of purity. There was this notion of intellectual revitalization, of a connection with the Turath, with the heritage, of an academic study, a very in-depth study of the classical books. However, for many Salafis, once that intellectual high subsided, and the many problems that people faced in their daily lives, and the realization that reading ancient textbooks will not necessarily solve those problems, especially the type of problems that caused the Arab Springs of economic issues, of difficulties in paying rent, of the GDPs, of simply living in your life in society. The appeal that classical strands of Salafism had rapidly declined, and many people found themselves reorganizing and reorienting their thoughts, and hence their Salafism continued to change and shift and evolve into different understandings, which is what we are currently seeing. And with that, I come to my conclusion and open the floor for Q&A.
صلى عليك الله يا خير الورى تعداد حبات الرمال وأكثرا صلى عليك الله ما غيث هما فوق السهول وبالجبال وبالقرى فوق السهول وبالجبال وبالقرى